Years later, Fenwick Galt would sit on a porch in country he didn't own and tell this story to anyone who'd listen. Not because he wanted praise, not because he thought himself brave, but because the truth of what happened in that canyon needed at least one honest voice.
I spent 17 years pulling gold from the ground. Never once asked what I was putting back.
Ground. And I never told a soul until...
Crooked Elk Creek wasn't a town. It was a wound in the earth, a limestone canyon where men had torn open the rock face and begged the dirt for mercy. Tents patched with flour sacks lined the water. Sluice boxes groaned under the weight of gravel and broken promises. Fenwick had been there 9 weeks. His claim, if you could call it that, sat at the narrow end of the canyon where the creek ran too fast and the light quit by 3 in the afternoon. He'd pulled enough dust to buy coffee and salt. That was all the earth was giving him. 43 years old. Grey eyes sunk deep into a face the wind had carved. A limp from a shaft collapse in Nevada that had taken 2 toes and most of his faith in luck. He carried everything he owned in a canvas pack, and he drank everything: water, coffee, whiskey, from a dented tin cup he'd had since Sacramento. The cup was empty more than it was full. Just like the man. Harlan Cobb's shack stood uphill from the creek, built over a mine shaft that hadn't produced in months. Nobody asked why Harlan stayed. Harlan was the kind of man who made questions feel dangerous. A former army quartermaster with hands like shovels and a voice that never rose above a murmur, which made every word sound like a threat wrapped in burlap. Fenwick had traded with Harlan twice. Coffee beans for candle stubs. A fair exchange, except nothing about Harlan felt fair. The man's eyes did arithmetic on everything they touched, calculating what he could take and what it would cost him. Young Delbert Swain followed Harlan like a shadow. 22 years old, strong as a mule, and twice as easy to lead. He carried Harlan's supplies, guarded Harlan's claim, and repeated Harlan's opinions as if they were scripture. It was Delbert who made the mistake. A Tuesday evening, cold enough that the creek wore a skin of ice at the edges. Fenwick had walked uphill to return a borrowed pickaxe. Delbert was supposed to be guarding the shack. Instead, he was 50 yards downstream, arguing with a mule that had bitten his sleeve. The shack door was open. Fenwick leaned the pickaxe against the frame, turned to leave, and heard it. A sound from below the floor. Not rats, not settling timber. Knocking. Deliberate. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. He stood still. The sound came again. From the root cellar beneath the floorboards. A pattern too steady to be anything but human. Fenwick knew what the smart move was. Walk away. This wasn't his business. Harlan Cobb was not a man you crossed over a strange noise in a floor. The smart move was to forget he'd heard anything, return to his played-out claim, and keep digging for dust that wasn't there.
Walk away, Galt. Just walk away.
His boots didn't listen. They carried him to the trap door, a heavy slab of pine planks bolted from the outside with an iron pin. Fresh scratches in the wood around the bolt. Someone had tried to open it from below. Tried hard. The scratches were deep and desperate. He pulled the pin, lifted the door. Lamplight from the shack above cut down into the darkness like a dull blade, and a pair of dark eyes stared up at him from the cold. A woman, Cheyenne, from the beadwork on what remained of her dress, wrists bound with rawhide, dried blood on her forearms where she'd torn her skin against the rope. Herbs, crushed and dried, were tucked into the folds of her clothing, as if even in captivity she'd been gathering medicine from whatever roots grew in that dark cellar. She looked up at Fenwick Galt. She didn't beg, didn't cry. Her face held the kind of stillness that comes after you've screamed yourself empty and found something harder underneath.
Are you his man?
Are you his man or your ON?
The question hit Fenwick like a fist. Not because it was complicated, but because he didn't know the answer. Behind him, somewhere down the creek, Delbert was still wrestling with the mule. Harlan was somewhere in the canyon. The evening was getting dark fast, and every second Fenwick stood there with that trapdoor open was a second closer to becoming either a dead man or a different one. He cut the rawhide with his belt knife. Didn't think about it, just drew the blade and sliced. The knots were tight, swollen with moisture from the cellar floor, and the woman's wrists were raw enough that Fenwick had to steady his hand to avoid cutting skin. She didn't thank him, didn't speak at all for the first 10 minutes. She climbed out of that cellar the way a trapped animal moves. Fast, low, every muscle ready to bolt or fight. Her eyes swept the shack, the door, the hillside beyond, calculating. She looked at him. That same measuring stare from the cellar, weighing whether this was rescue or a different kind of trap.
The creek trail, east. Do not take the ridge. He has traps there.
She knew the land better than he did. Even after days in that cellar, her sense of direction was sharp as flint. They moved east along the creek bed, staying low where the limestone walls threw long shadows. Fenwick's limp slowed them. She didn't comment on it, but she adjusted her pace. Not from kindness, he thought, but because a partner who falls behind makes noise. They walked for 3 hours. She told him nothing. Not her name, not how long Cobb had held her, not what he'd wanted. Fenwick didn't push. He understood the arithmetic of trust. You don't ask for what hasn't been offered. You earn it, one silent mile at a time. When dawn came, pale and cold, frost on the sagebrush, she finally spoke.
The basin where the painted rocks stand. 2 days walk from here. Maybe LES, if your leg holds.
What do I call you?
Fair enough. Fenwick had been called worse things by people he'd helped more. She tested him the entire journey. Small tests, the kind you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. She asked him to carry her herb bundle. He did, without opening it. She pointed out a deer trail and asked if he wanted to hunt. He said they didn't have time. She led him past a quartz outcropping streaked with colour, the kind of rock that makes a prospector's hands itch. Fenwick looked at it, looked away, kept walking. Each test, she watched his face. Not his words, his face. 17 years of prospecting had taught Fenwick to lie with his mouth, but his eyes always told the truth, and Walk's Far woman read eyes the way he read creek beds. On the second morning, they crested a ridge and painted rock basin opened below. A wide meadow cradled by sandstone formations, streaked with ochre and iron red. Teepees rose in a loose circle near a cottonwood stand, blazing gold. Smoke drifted low from cooking fires. Horses grazed. Children ran between the lodges. It was the most alive place Fenwick had seen in years. Crooked Elk Creek was a wound. This was a heartbeat. The welcome was not warm. Warriors met them at the basin's edge. 4 men with faces that said Fenwick's presence was a problem, not a gift. Walk's Far woman spoke rapidly in Cheyenne. The warriors didn't lower their guard, but they didn't raise weapons either. An elder emerged from the largest teepee. Iron Teeth, that's what the young men called him. 70 winters carved into a face like weathered oak. His eyes were clouded with the milky haze of fading sight, But when he looked at Fenwick, the prospector felt seen all the way down to the bone.
Granddaughter says you opened a door. OHI.
Iron Teeth said nothing for a long time. The silence between them was a conversation Fenwick couldn't quite translate, but he knew enough to hold still and let it happen. The old man reached into his robe and withdrew a piece of tanned hide, thin, supple, marked with charcoal lines and small painted symbols. A map, creek lines, ridge marks, and at the center, a cave mouth marked with two painted hands, one giving, one receiving. He held the map toward Fenwick, an offering, or so it seemed. But behind Iron Teeth, Walk's Far Woman's eyes were fixed on Fenwick with an intensity that had nothing to do with gratitude. She leaned close to her grandfather and whispered words Fenwick couldn't hear. And Iron Teeth, nearly blind, ancient as the sandstone, smiled. The kind of smile a man wears when he's set a trap and the prey has just stepped exactly where he wanted. Fenwick studied that map for 2 days. He sat at the edge of the Cheyenne camp, tolerated, not welcomed, and traced the charcoal lines with a fingertip worn smooth by 17 years of gravel and stone. The creek paths made sense. The ridge markers matched terrain he'd seen, and the cave mouth. It sat above Crooked Elk Creek, maybe 4 miles upstream from the mining camp. He told himself he was going to see the caves because Iron Teeth had offered, because a gift refused is an insult. But Fenwick was an honest enough liar to know the truth scratching at the back of his skull, the word he'd been chasing since California.
Gold. There's always gold in limestone caves near hot springs. Always.
The old lie, the one that had kept him digging through 17 years of empty shafts and played out claims. His bones knew it was a lie. His hands hadn't gotten the message yet. Walk's Far Woman found him packing his canvas bag at dawn on the 3rd day. She stood 4 paces away, the exact distance she'd maintained since the journey began. Close enough to speak, far enough to run.
Dad Naris dives.
Your grandfather, SHO'd me the path.
He showed you a C choice.
Not a path.
A CA choice. There is a difference.
I spoke what needed saying, Fenwick.
Now will you finally let it
Fenwick didn't understand. He would, but not yet. Not in time. He found the spirit caves by midday. The entrance sat behind a curtain of juniper on a limestone shelf above the creek. Inside, the air changed, warm, mineral-rich, carrying the scent of deep earth and ancient water. Torchlight revealed the walls, and Fenwick's breath stopped. Pictographs, hundreds of them. Horses running in red ochre, stars mapped in white clay, rivers drawn in charcoal that still looked wet. Handprints, dozens of handprints, some so small they belonged to children, and at the center of the largest wall, the same image from the map. 2 hands, one giving, one receiving. The spring was deeper inside. Warm water rising from somewhere below, pooling in a natural basin before draining into the limestone. The water tasted of minerals, sharp, clean, alive in a way that creek water never was. Fenwick crouched by the spring and filled his tin cup. He looked at the painted walls, at the handprints, at the record of people who had come to this place not to take, but to remember. And that's when he heard the boots.
We're not leaving without it. I told you it was here.
Harlan Cobb's voice echoed off limestone before his body appeared. Low, controlled. The murmur that meant violence was close and patient.
When you had the chance. Figured you'd LE'd me here eventually, Galt. Didn't have the ASK right. Just had to follow the
Harlan stood at the cave mouth. Behind him, Delbert Swain, pale-faced, rifle in both hands, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on Earth. And behind Delbert, Corporal Tull, the Fort Laramie man whose honor could be purchased for whiskey and promises. 3 men, 2 guns, 1 cave full of sacred history that Harlan Cobb saw only as a mine he hadn't opened yet.
I knew that woman would run to her people, and I knew her people would send someone back to these caves.
The words landed like stones, because Harlan was right. Fenwick had carried the map. He had walked straight from Painted Rock Basin to the Spirit Caves, and Harlan, patient, calculating Harlan, had simply followed. The map wasn't a reward, it was a test, and Fenwick had failed it, led the enemy straight to the place he'd been trusted to honor.
Iron Teeth knew. He knew I'd come here, and he knew someone would follow.
The old man's smile. The trap that wasn't for Fenwick, but for Fenwick. To see what he'd do when the moment came. Whether the man who opened a cellar door would also close a cave mouth. Harlan shoved past Fenwick toward the spring. His eyes swept the walls, not seeing the pictographs, the handprints, the centuries of memory. Seeing only rock, only potential.
Mineral deposits, hot springs veins underneath. We blast through that back wall and I guarantee there's a seam of gold behind it that'll...
He pulled a stick of dynamite from his coat, held it up like a promise. Fenwick looked at the painted hands on the wall. One giving, one receiving. He looked at his empty tin cup, still wet from the spring. He looked at 17 years of digging and the hole it had carved, not in the ground, but in him. And then Fenwick Galt did the most expensive thing he'd ever done in his life. He stepped between Harlan Cobb and the cave wall.
You will fall in line now. No more questions.
No, this place isn't YOR's. It isn't my inn either. And you're not putting a charge into that wall.
Harlan's eyes narrowed. The dynamite stayed in his fist.
You're choosing savages over gold? You're choosing painted rocks over everything you've spent your whole miserable life
Fenwick's
chasing?
voice came out quiet. The quietest it had been in years.
I do. Yeah.
The cave held its breath. Water dripped from the ceiling in a rhythm that sounded like counting. Like the earth was measuring the seconds until someone made a choice that couldn't be taken back.
One chance, Fenwick.
Harlan raised his rifle with one hand, the dynamite stick still gripped in the other. Fenwick stood between him and the painted wall.
To that wall.
No weapon, no leverage.
I will.
Just a man-shaped obstacle between greed and something sacred.
Brave, standing there like some kind of hero. You're a pro-living prospector who hasn't found anything. You're gonna die in 9 weeks.
Your honor is
Fenwick
alive.
didn't argue.
Your name means nothing.
Arguments were for men who needed to convince themselves.
No, I haven't.
He was past that.
Harlan. There's no gold behind that wall.
I've been reading rock for 17 years. Limestone, hot springs, mineral deposits skewered out. I know what gold country looks like. It's paintings. They're real.
Harlan's jaw worked. The arithmetic behind his eyes, always calculating, always weighing, flickered with something Fenwick hadn't seen there before.
The Cheyenne guard this
Doubt.
place because it's worth something.
It is worth something. Just nothing you can see airy.
Behind Harlan, something shifted. Delbert Swain lowered his rifle. Slowly, the way a man moves when he's making a decision his body hasn't caught up with yet. His face was ash white. His eyes moved from Harlan to the painted walls, to the tiny handprints, and something in that young man's chest cracked open like an egg.
Children's hands on that wall.
I don't see AR whose hands. No. I'll do it myself.
I do. I'm done, sir.
Delbert stepped backward.
Choosing a different path.
1 step, 2. His rifle hung at his side, like something he'd forgotten he was holding. Corporal Tull watched him go, and the corporal's face did its own mathematics. A soldier who'd sold his honor for whiskey, watching a young man buy his back for free. Tull holstered his sidearm, didn't say a word, just turned and followed Delbert toward the cave mouth. The sound of their boots faded into daylight.
We must decide, Harlan. I know. Give me a moment. You left me with nothing.
Harlan stood alone. The dynamite trembled in his fist, not from cold, but from the particular vibration of a man watching his last plan collapse around him like a rotten mine shaft.
You had a woman locked in a cellar, Harlan. That's what you had.
The words landed in the silence between drips.
Not the plan.
Harlan's face shifted. The calculation, the bravado, the desperate architecture of self-justification, all of it sliding like loose shale on a hillside. He didn't drop the dynamite. He set it down, carefully, on the cave floor, the way you put down something you've been carrying too long. Then he walked out of the spirit caves without looking at the walls, without looking at Fennec, without looking at anything at all. Some men change. Some men just leave. Harlan Cobb disappeared from Crooked Elk Creek that winter. Rumor said he went south to the Arizona territories. Rumor said a lot of things. Fennec never bothered to find out which ones were true. Walk's Far woman came to the caves the next morning. She brought iron teeth, the old man walking slowly, one hand on her shoulder, his clouded eyes aimed at nothing and everything. He moved through the cave by touch and memory. His fingers found the pictographs without hesitation, tracing horses, stars, rivers, reading with his skin what his eyes could no longer see. When he reached the painted hands, he stopped. He turned toward Fennec. Those clouded eyes held a clarity that had nothing to do with sight.
The weight is heavy, Elder. You carried an empty cup your WHO life, gold digger. You brought it here, and the cup is still empty.
The old man reached into the warm spring, cupped the mineral water in his palms, and poured it into Fennec's battered tin cup. The water caught the torchlight. For a moment, it looked like liquid gold. Walk's Far woman watched from the cave entrance, arms crossed, face unreadable, except for the corners of her mouth, which carried the faintest suggestion of something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't far from one either.
You failed the test. You know that, right? You led him straight here.
I understand.
I was wrong.
But you stood in front of the wall. That was not part of the test.
That was mine. That was mine.
You came back.
She nodded. Once.
I know.
The kind of nod that closes one account and opens another. Fenwick Galt never found gold. Not that winter, not any winter after. He stopped looking, which for a man who'd spent 17 years with his hands in the dirt was the hardest thing he ever did. He stayed near Painted Rock Basin. Not in the camp. He didn't belong there, and he was honest enough to know it. But close. Close enough that iron teeth could teach him the names of the pictographs, one by one, afternoon by afternoon. Close enough that Walk's Far Woman could show him which roots healed and which ones harmed. Knowledge worth more than any seam of ore. Delbert Swain turned up at the basin that spring. Thinner. Quieter. He asked Walk's Far Woman if there was work he could do. Not for gold, not for promises, just for the right to be somewhere that felt clean. She put him to hauling water. He didn't complain. The spirit caves stayed hidden. The pictographs kept their stories. The springs ran warm and constant, feeding the creek that fed the land, that fed the people who'd been there longer than anyone with a sluice box and a dream. Years later, sitting on a porch he'd built himself, in country he still didn't own, but had finally learned to belong to, Fenwick would hold that dented tin cup in both hands and tell anyone who'd listen.
I spent 17 years digging for gold. Turns out the most valuable thing I ever found was a locked door, and the good sense to open it.
The cup was never empty again.